David Halloran trusted numbers more than he trusted people, and he trusted the stories people told about themselves even less. Numbers didn't smile at you for years and then, without warning, decide you weren't worth staying for. Numbers didn't apologize and mean it, and then quietly do something else instead. Numbers just sat there, patient and merciless, waiting to be read correctly. And if you read them wrong, at least you only had yourself to blame. He was 37 years old. In the 2 years since the week that changed everything, he had gotten very good at making sure nothing else in his life needed to be read at all. Least of all him. At Solvang Energy's pilot plant on the edge of Golden, Colorado, people had a saying about David, though nobody remembered exactly who'd started it. If the numbers go wrong, get David. It wasn't affection, not exactly. It was closer to respect, the wary kind people give something reliable and slightly unknowable like a good knife for a quiet dog. If a compressor started making a sound nobody could place, if the electrolyzer stack drew current strangely at 3 in the morning, if a whole simulation refused to line up with what the sensors were reporting, David was the one who sat with the raw numbers until they told him the truth. He rarely explained himself while he worked. He rarely explained himself at all, but he was, without exception, right, and after enough years of being right, people had simply stopped expecting him to also be warm. Howard Bell, technically retired, unable to stay away from the building that had employed him for 30 years, was the one person who still tried. "You're eating lunch at your desk again," Howard said one gray Tuesday morning, setting a cup of bad coffee on David's desk without being asked. "Every day. Like a man doing penance. I eat lunch where the work is. The work is everywhere, David. That's not an excuse, it's a diagnosis." Mostly because he never quite stopped trying, in his own patient way, to chip at the edges of it. The plant itself spread across 4 acres at the edge of town, a cluster of steel towers, pipe racks, and squat reinforced buildings that from the highway looked like an abstract sculpture, and up close revealed itself as a small, dense city built to answer one specific question. How do you take ordinary water and, using nothing but electricity pulled from a wind farm and a solar array a few miles south, split it apart into hydrogen and oxygen at a scale worth calling industrial? The answer lived in a dozen structures, each with its own job. The electrolyzer hall held row after row of stacked cells, each one roughly the size of a filing cabinet, humming through the water-splitting reaction 18 hours a day at a frequency you felt in your back teeth before you consciously registered the sound. Beside it stood the compression building, low and armored, where the hydrogen produced next door was squeezed down to a fraction of its original volume and pushed into pressurized storage. A process that, handled correctly, was almost boring in its reliability, and handled incorrectly could turn an ordinary afternoon into a very bad one in the space of a few seconds. Above it all sat the control room, glass-walled and cool, banked with screens tracking every pressure reading, every flow rate, every temperature across the site, all day, every day, whether or not a human being happened to be watching. Hydrogen itself was the reason all of it had to be handled so carefully. It was the smallest molecule there was, small enough to slip through seals that held everything else, small enough to work its way into metal over time and make the metal brittle from the inside, small and flammable enough that a leak could burn almost invisibly in broad daylight, with no smoke and barely any color, before anyone noticed the heat. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't easily see it. You had to trust the sensors and trust the people reading them, because by the time a hydrogen fire was obvious to the naked eye, it usually wasn't small anymore. David sometimes thought, though he never said it out loud, that grief worked the same way. You didn't always see where it was leaking from. You just had to notice early when something felt subtly wrong before it stopped being small. It happened on a Wednesday in early October at 6:52 in the morning, before most of the day's shift had clocked in. A pressure sensor on line 4 spiked, dropped, and spiked again, the kind of erratic signal that could mean a faulty instrument or could mean gas leaking into a space it wasn't supposed to be. The automatic system did what it was built to do. It isolated the line, vented what it could to the flare stack, and tripped the hall-wide alarm, a long, flat, mechanical wail that sent the 4 technicians on shift jogging for the exits exactly as they'd been trained to. Nobody was hurt. That was the fact everyone would repeat afterward, in every meeting, like a charm meant to ward off a worse version of events that hadn't happened, but easily could have. Nobody was hurt. But for 11 minutes, a section of the electrolyzer hall had hydrogen concentrations climbing toward numbers that made grown engineers go quiet when they saw them on a log later. And for 11 minutes, nobody knew for certain whether the isolation had worked or whether they were about to find out what happened when hydrogen met a spark in an enclosed space at industrial scale. David got the call at 6:58, already in his car, already halfway to work out of pure habit before his phone finished ringing. He didn't remember driving the rest of the way. He remembered pulling into the lot and seeing the flashing lights of the county's hazmat unit and thinking with a strange, cold clarity, I told them this would happen. He had. 8 months earlier, in a report almost nobody read past the summary page, David had flagged the aging pressure relief valves on line 4 as a rising risk and recommended a full replacement cycle instead of the patchwork repairs they'd been doing. He'd been told, politely, that the budget for that quarter didn't support it. He'd pushed once, in a meeting, and been told, less politely, that engineering needed to trust operations to manage risk within the numbers they'd been given. He hadn't pushed a second time. He'd told himself the sensors would catch anything serious before it became a real problem. The sensors had caught it. 11 minutes was still too long. Corporate's response was immediate and bureaucratically merciless. A full shutdown of line 4 pending investigation, a freeze on the funding review schedule for the following month, and an emergency safety audit starting that same week, led by a name David didn't recognize. Carla Reyes arrived on Friday morning, 2 days after the incident, a laptop bag over one shoulder and an expression that made it clear she wasn't there to make friends. "You're Halloran," she said, not quite a question, before he'd finished crossing the room. "I am." "Good. You're the one I need to talk to." She didn't offer her hand. "I've read your incident report from 8 months ago. The one flagging the valves on line 4. The one that got buried." Something in David's chest went rigid. Not relief at being vindicated, not yet, just old defensiveness rising fast, like a hand thrown up against a blow. "If you're here to find someone to blame, I can point you toward the budget committee. I'm not here to find someone to blame. I'm here to find out what actually happened, which is a different job, even if it doesn't always feel that way from where you're standing." Her eyes didn't leave his. "But since you brought it up, you knew about the valve risk for 8 months and let it ride. I flagged it. Repeatedly. I was overruled. You were overruled once, based on the file I've got. After that, it looks like you stopped pushing." Her voice stayed level, but there was an edge in it now, precise as a blade. "I've seen this before. Good engineer sees a problem, gets shut down once, decides the fight isn't worth it, and then a valve fails and 11 minutes go by where nobody knows if the building's about to come apart. I'm not interested in whose fault that is on paper. I'm interested in why a man who clearly understood the risk stopped saying so out loud." The words landed harder than David expected, harder because some small, unwelcome part of him agreed with them. His jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about how this plant runs. I know hydrogen doesn't care about your budget committee." She held his gaze without blinking. "And I know that for 11 minutes, 4 of your technicians stood outside, not knowing if they'd have jobs to come back to, or worse. So forgive me if I'm not overly concerned this morning with your feelings about being questioned." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The plant hummed on around them, steady and indifferent, the way it always did, the way it had for 11 long minutes while everyone waited to find out if it would stay that way. "Line 4 stays down until I say otherwise," Carla said finally, turning toward the control room. "I'll need every report you've filed this past year. Every one you wanted to file, too, if there's a difference." She walked off without waiting for him to agree. David stood there for a long moment, hands and fists at his sides, feeling something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit, the specific cornered fury of being seen too clearly by someone who had no idea what she was actually looking at. The weeks that followed were among the worst David had spent at Solvang since that other week, 2 years back, the one he never referenced out loud, and there was a grim, private irony in that he shared with no one. Carla was thorough in a way that felt, at first, almost punitive. She pulled every maintenance log going back 3 years. She interviewed every technician who'd worked line 4, some of them twice. She found 2 more instances, smaller, undocumented, where operators had noted minor pressure anomalies and moved on without escalating, because escalating meant paperwork, and paperwork meant delay, and delay meant missing a deadline that upper management cared about a great deal more than they cared about anomalies nobody could yet prove were dangerous. This isn't a valve problem, Carla told the assembled leadership team 10 days into the investigation in a conference room where David sat rigid near the back. This is a culture problem. People here have learned that flagging risk gets you overruled, so they've stopped flagging it, and the plant got lucky for 11 minutes instead of unlucky. With respect, said Aldous Finn, the site director, a man who wore his tie a little too tight, we can't run a facility where every hesitation gets treated like a 5-alarm fire. With respect, Carla said back, in a tone that made clear the phrase was doing no actual work, you can't run a hydrogen facility any other way. That's not my opinion. That's chemistry. David watched her hold the room. You flagged this 8 months ago, he said, quiet, almost accusing, as if the flagging itself had been the offense. Why didn't you push harder? David looked at him for a long moment. I did push. Once. I was told to trust the process. Then you should have pushed twice. There it was, laid out plain. The company that hadn't listened, now blaming him for not making them listen harder. Something old and tired rose behind David's ribs, a feeling he recognized from somewhere he didn't let himself visit anymore. You should have seen it coming. You should have said something. By the 3rd week, something between David and Carla had shifted, though neither of them would have called it warmth yet. It was closer to the truce 2 people reach after watching each other refuse to back down under pressure and deciding, grudgingly, that this made the other one trustworthy rather than merely difficult. You didn't have to defend me in there, David said one evening, after a meeting where Carla had cut Finn off mid-sentence to point out, coolly, that blaming the engineer who'd raised the alarm was not, in fact, a safety strategy. I wasn't defending you, Carla said, not looking up from her laptop. I was defending the report. You happened to be attached to it. Sure, I mean it. If the report had been garbage, I'd have said so, whoever wrote it. She looked up at him, then, something almost amused in the set of her mouth. It happens not to be garbage. That's not the same as liking you. Feels the same from here. Don't get used to it. But there was no edge in it this time, just the dry, testing shape of something that might, someday, be a joke they both understood. The debrief dinner happened a month into the investigation, a low-key affair in a private room at a downtown steakhouse, the kind of forced casual event corporate scheduled to signal that the crisis was, allegedly, under control. David hadn't wanted to go. Howard had all but ordered him to. He was standing near the bar, a glass of water in hand, because he didn't trust himself with anything stronger that week, when Greg Amundsen, an old colleague from the Denver office, 3 drinks deep and looking for someone to reminisce with, wandered over. David Halloran. Man, it's been years. Greg clapped him on the shoulder. Too hard, too familiar. Hey, you still in touch with anybody from the old crowd? I ran into someone last month who mentioned Laura. Said she'd moved to Denver with. Greg stopped. Something in David's face had gone very still, very fast, the kind of stillness that has weight to it, the kind you can feel from 3 feet away. Anyway, Greg said, too quickly, already backing off, good seeing you, man, and disappeared toward the appetizer table with the urgency of a man who'd just realized he'd stepped on something buried. Carla, standing a few feet away, had caught all of it. The name, the sudden freeze, the careful blankness David pulled over his face like a tarp thrown across something broken. She didn't say anything right away. She just noticed the way she noticed everything and filed it somewhere quiet, the same place she kept every unexplained pressure reading until it made sense. The investigation's findings came due on a Thursday. A systemic pattern of ignored risk flags across 3 years, a recommendation for a full valve replacement program plant-wide, and, buried in an appendix nobody outside the review committee would likely read, a note that David's original report should have triggered a hard stop 8 months earlier, and hadn't because of decisions made 2 levels above his authority. It should have felt like vindication. It didn't. In the meeting where the findings were presented, Finn sat stone-faced, and afterward, in the hallway, told David flatly that his communication style during the crisis had created friction, and that HR would likely want to discuss it. David listened without arguing. Something in him had gone very quiet, quieter than usual, quiet in a way that had nothing left underneath it to draw on. That night, he printed a resignation letter. He didn't sign it, but he printed it and set it on his desk and sat looking at it in the dark, the way a man looks at a decision he's already made and is only pretending to still be considering. Carla found him there at 9:30, having come back for a folder she'd left behind. She saw the letter before he could turn it over. "You're quitting. I'm thinking about it. You caught the risk 8 months before it happened. You built half the case that just saved this plant from repeating the mistake at scale. And you're thinking about quitting now." Her voice had an edge to it, but underneath the edge was something that sounded, for the first time, like real alarm. "I'm tired, Carla." His voice cracked slightly on her name, more than he meant it to. "I'm tired of being the person who sees the problem and gets punished for it anyway. I'm tired of being right and having it cost me something every single time. This isn't just about the valves." It wasn't a question. David looked up at her, and something in him, worn down by weeks of pressure, stripped raw by Greg's slip at the steakhouse, exhausted past the point of being able to keep the door shut any longer, simply gave way. "Her name was Laura," he said, and the words came out rough, unpracticed, like something dragged up from very far down. "We were supposed to get married. 2 days before the wedding, she left. She left with Jonan, my best friend since I was 14 years old. Best man at the wedding, or he was supposed to be." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "I built my whole life around trusting numbers instead of people after that. Numbers don't leave. Numbers don't smile at you for years and then decide you weren't worth staying for." He gestured at the letter, at the valve reports, at all of it. "And I still did the exact same thing here. I trusted the process. I flagged the risk once, got told no, and believed the system would catch it instead of me. I was wrong twice in one lifetime, Carla. I'd like to stop being wrong about who deserves my trust." Carla was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its edge completely. "You weren't wrong to trust the process, David. You were wrong to think trusting it meant you didn't also have to keep fighting." She pulled the second chair over, close enough that their knees nearly touched, and sat down. "And you weren't wrong about Laura, either. Some people just aren't built to hold the thing they promised to hold. That's not a flaw in your judgment. That's a flaw in theirs." She held his gaze, steady, unwilling to let him look away from it. "You've spent 2 years eating lunch alone at your desk like you're the one who owes somebody an apology. You don't. Whatever you think you should have seen coming, whatever you think you should have fought harder for, none of it was yours to carry. It was never your fault, David. Not then. Not the valves, either. You can stop doing penance for other people's decisions anytime you're ready. Feels like my flaw, some days. It isn't." She reached over and, carefully, turned the letter face down on the desk, the way you turn over a card you decided not to play. "You don't get to quit on this plant because 2 people broke a promise to you 2 years ago, and Aldous Finn is a coward with a tight tie. Those are 2 completely different problems, and you're letting one bleed into the other." David let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 years. "That's a very clinical way of putting it. I'm a very clinical person. It's why I'm good at my job." The corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly, cutting through the heaviness in the room. "Also, for the record, if you quit now, I did 4 weeks of extremely thorough extremely unpleasant work for absolutely nothing, and I will hold that against you personally for the rest of your life. Something in David's chest loosened, the way it hadn't in longer than he could remember. That does sound like a threat. It's a professional opinion. Carla held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and this time there was nothing clinical in it at all. Stay. Fight for the fix instead of walking away from the fight. I'll be right here, making sure nobody overrules you again without a very good reason. David looked at her for a long moment. At the steadiness of her, the plainness of what she'd offered. No promises dressed up as more than they were, just a simple, solid things set down between them. He picked up the letter, folded it once, and dropped it in the trash without signing it. Okay, he said. Let's fix it. The valve replacement program went ahead within the month. Funded in full, no committee vote required. A single email from the executive team was enough. Once 11 minutes, and Carla's report had made the cost of doing nothing painfully clear. David, even Finn, to his credit, stood up in the closing meeting and said, stiffly but sincerely, that the plant was safer for having listened, eventually, to the person who'd been right the whole time. David didn't say anything in response. He didn't need to. For the first time in 8 months, being right hadn't cost him anything at all. 2 weeks later, a new vendor contact walked into the plant to finalize a valve supply contract for the replacement program. And David looked up from his laptop to see a face he hadn't seen in 2 years, holding a cardboard box of sample parts like a man holding a bomb he didn't know how to put down. David, Jonan said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. For a long second, David simply looked at him. Older now, grayer at the temples, sweating slightly despite the mild office temperature. Behind him, Howard, catching the tension immediately, murmured, "Well, would you look at that?" in the tone of a man who'd just been handed the best entertainment of his week. "You two know each other?" asked the vendor rep, glancing between them with growing unease. "You could say that," David said. Jonan set the box down like it might go off. "I didn't know this account was yours. I swear, I'd have asked someone else to take it if I've thought about calling you. For 2 years, I never knew what to say. I still don't know what to say. I'm sorry doesn't even." Jonan stopped talking so abruptly, it was almost comedic. David studied him for a moment. The guilt, the sweat, the hand rubbing anxiously at the back of his neck, and felt, to his own quiet surprise, none of the old cold fury he'd braced for. Only something close to pity, and underneath the pity, something that felt almost like relief. He'd spent so long treating this exact moment like a bomb waiting to go off. It turned out to be nothing but a nervous man holding a box of valve fittings. "Relax," David said. "I'm not going to throw anything at you." "You what?" "Nothing. Old joke." He crossed his arms, and for the first time in 2 years, thinking about Jonan didn't feel like touching a burn. "How's the pricing on these? Because if it's as unstable as you look right now, we've got a real problem." Jonan blinked, caught entirely off guard, and near the doorway, Carla bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing out loud. That evening, David and Carla sat outside the plant on the old picnic bench by the fence line, watching the sun go down behind the mountains in long orange stripes. Line 4 hummed quiet and steady behind them, doing exactly what it was built to do. "A month ago, I had a resignation letter on my desk," David said. "Now I'm sitting out here with the person who talked me out of it." "I didn't talk you out of anything." Carla bumped her shoulder against his, easy and warm. "I just told you quitting would waste 4 weeks of my very hard work. I was protecting my own reputation." "Is that really what that was?" "Mostly." She smiled, slow, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes. "Okay, not mostly. I didn't want you to leave." The reputation thing just sounded better out loud. David looked at her for a moment, something warm settling in his chest. "You could have just said that and missed the look on your face right now." "No chance." She tilted her head, studying him the way she studied a bad pressure reading. Except now, there was nothing clinical in it at all. You've got a nice face when you're not scowling at spreadsheets. You know that. I don't scowl at spreadsheets. You absolutely do. It's the same face you're making right now. Actually, just softer. She reached out and smoothed the line between his eyebrows with her thumb, unhurried, like she had every right to be there. There. Better. David caught her hand before it pulled away and held it, his thumb tracing slow circles over her knuckles. For what it's worth, he said, quieter now, you were right about everything. The process. Laura. All of it. I know. I'm always right. It's a burden. She laced her fingers through his, like it was the easiest thing in the world, like they'd done it 100 times before. You know what else I'm right about? I'm almost afraid to ask. That you've been wanting to kiss me since the steakhouse, and you've been too stubborn to admit it. David felt his ears go warm, and he didn't bother denying it. That's not exactly a hard read. You're not that mysterious, Reyes. Neither are you, Halloran. She leaned in close enough that he could feel her breath against his jaw, close enough that neither of them was pretending anymore. So why are we still talking? Good question. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It felt like something they'd both been circling for weeks and had finally, gladly, stopped running from. When they pulled apart, Carla was grinning, her forehead still resting against his. For the record, she murmured, Howard already told Priya from procurement that we're together. She owes him $20. David blinked, laughing despite himself. There was a bet. During an active safety investigation. There's always a bet, David. You work with engineers. Everybody's tracking something. She kissed him again, quick and light this time, then settled her head against his shoulder, comfortable like it belonged there. They sat like that a while longer, not saying much else, not needing to. Behind them, the plant hummed on into the dark, running steady, running true, no longer needing anyone to push it, and neither for the first time in 2 years did he.